Hi, everyone. Welcome to our conversation today with Paddy Goffey. Paddy is from the High Pay Centre, an organisation that we work with a lot at ShareAction. But without further ado, I'll let Paddy to introduce yourself. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ruan. Thanks for having me today for this chat. So, as Ruan mentioned, I work for the High Pay Centre. We're essentially a small think tank. We produce research on corporate governance reform, inequality, and kind of wider responsible business practice. And this is the ultimate aim of promoting fairer pay policies that work towards fairer pay and reducing economic inequality. And we mainly do this kind of from two key angles. So, firstly, we advocate for measures to enhance pay for lower middle income workers whose wages we know have stagnated over recent years. And secondly, we scrutinize and provide commentary on often can be outsized financial rewards received by small groups of top executives, essentially those at the top of companies who get paid uh, large amounts when compared to employees in their companies. So that's what the High Pay Centre does essentially.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. I mean, there is so much overlap with the sort of themes and topics that we work on with what you were just discussing, particularly with our work on living wages, and as you say, the importance of that for low and middle income workers, particularly at a time of the cost of living crisis. So yeah, it'd be really good to know sort of what sort of specifically the High Pay Centre has been doing recently.
Yeah, we've been busy as ever really with a range of campaigns and research projects. I won't go over all of them, but kind of the big ones we've been working on over the last year. Firstly, we launched a manifesto of policies called the Charter for Fair Pay, and that set out 10 policies for reducing economic inequality pre-taxation. And the key bit there is pre-taxation. So, of course, we all understand there is a role for progressive taxation in ensuring that wealth is distributed more evenly. But we also know that lots of inequality in this country is a result of processes at work. I'm sure you're familiar with that with Good Work and everything, all the work they do there. So we know that these kind of processes determine actually how much people receive even before taxation occurs. So we set out 10 measures to ensure a fairer distribution of wealth whilst also boosting productivity and growth. And that could include things like stronger employee engagement, which we'll get onto a bit later, trade union rights, increased pay transparency, and also potential for using things like tax incentives to stimulate more responsible business practice. More recently, we launched our annual pay ratios report, where we analysed the gap between CEO and median employee pay at the UK's largest companies. And the headline figure from that was we found that the CEO to median employee pay ratio, the average remains high at 78 to 1 in the FTSE 100. So basically, that means the average CEO is getting paid 78 times the average employee amongst FTSE 100 companies. And that, of course, reflects those real embedded inequalities in the British corporate system. And this project is really important for us to annually, as it allows us to highlight and track these trends in income inequality within firms and across different sectors. And of course, we offer recommendations on how to reduce such internal disparities within firms. So that's just two of the things we've been up to recently. But of course, there is more going on, but those are kind of the two main things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned the CEO pay ratio reports that the High Pay Centre put out. We find them really valuable in framing our engagement with the companies that we engage with. Particularly, I mean, if you look at the FTSE 100 companies, including retail companies that have been such a focus of ours recently, they have such high disparities between the CEO pay and their hourly paid colleagues. And income inequality is such a cause for concern, not just in the UK but also globally. And it's just really great that the resources that the High Pay Centre puts out there exist to really shine a spotlight on that. It would be really good to know, what's been your focus this AGM season? What have you been engaging companies on this year in particular?
Yeah, so we have engaged with a range of companies this AGM season. Thanks, of course, to ShareAction for helping us out with that. It's been a big hand, and it's been a really interesting process for us. So we focused our engagement efforts on the issue of enhancing worker voice and employee engagement within companies. And essentially, we went to AGMs and highlighted the importance of companies adopting formal mechanisms to ensure that workers have this voice in particular appointing worker directors to boards. And essentially, we ask companies directly about why they haven't implemented these practices and really emphasize in this case that meaningful employee engagement is crucial for developing long-term business success. So that's, yeah, employee engagement was our focus. We have done kind of in previous years looking at pay and these issues, but I know that ShareAction's volunteers and people in the good work team cover those issues so well already. So that's why we focus on engagement this year.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned those AGMs. From my understanding, it's been a real pleasure to facilitate your access, and it's such a valuable perspective that you bring to those AGMs. So yeah, as I said, it's been a real pleasure. It would be really good to know a little bit more as to why in particular is worker voice so important from a worker's perspective.
So engagement and voice, it's vital from a workers' perspective because it allows employees to be provided with essentially influence over decisions that affect their work, their daily working lives, their well-being, and their job satisfaction. And it really stands to reason that employees should have a say over kind of the mechanisms and processes and how what their daily working life looks like. Considering you're going to be there 5 days a week, multiple hours a week, so you should really have a say over how that looks. And kind of on the research side, we know that research shows that engaged employees typically exhibit higher morale, increased productivity levels, and it's kind of an intuitive conclusion that when workers feel heard and valued, it's going to foster a sense of ownership and motivation, and ultimately to enhanced workplace outcomes. An interesting statistic I think Gallup data shows that only 9% of UK workers feel engaged in their jobs. So this is clearly an area where something is going very wrong. And company decision making on issues like compensation or other kind of factors that affect our working lives should be kind of incorporated in worker views so they reflect the needs and interests of those workers. And as I said, that can have a range of practical benefits, such as enhancing wages and living standards for employees across the UK.
Yeah, that 9% figure is really quite striking, and as clearly as you say, something needs to be done about that. I think it's a really important point that you make around those sort of knock-on effects. When you empower workers, give them a voice, engage them, you're going to see benefits down the line, not just for the worker, but for the business as well. And ensuring that those boardrooms, factor in a diverse range of stakeholders and not just factor in, but involve them in the decision-making processes. You're going to see benefits for all of those stakeholders, which is just good for any business. It would be good to hear you sort of explore on that, and particularly those benefits a little bit more.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. It's not just about workers. This is actually something that's in the interests of companies themselves. As I mentioned there, engaged employees can help ensure a company is more productive, innovative, and ultimately performing better. If employees are involved in decision making, they're more likely to be motivated and aligned with the wider company's goals. That can reduce features like employee turnover, absenteeism, these two features that impact negatively on productivity within the company. And also, I think a point that's perhaps not made enough is that directors that are drawn directly from the workforce, from their employee base, are going to diversify the professional and life experience of the board, including operational understanding of the company that you're unlikely to get from the other board members because they aren't drawn directly from the workforce. They don't understand kind of the day-to-day realities, what it's like working on the front line of these companies. So they really do hold potential to improve the effectiveness of decision making. Additionally, research shows that mechanisms like directors drawn from the workforce can help direct boards away from the corporate short-termism that's often dominate decision making in the UK. So research and development expenditure is twice as high in countries in European countries with strong worker representation compared to those with weak participation. And that's understandable, really. Workers are going to be naturally incentivized to favor investment into the business so that it thrives in the long term and their jobs are safe. So it's really kind of something that's going to help both workers themselves as well as the long-term viability, success, and performance of the company.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's such a sort of focus on productivity right now, and the difficulties that the the UK economy has found itself in, and I think it just is really important to bring this angle to the debate and really highlight the need for greater employee input and using that as a tool in itself to be able to better the economy. And it's sort of maybe linking that to a wider point around society as well. I mean, why is this so important to that broader picture?
It's crucial. I mean, we've just spoken about that Gallup data on how workers in the UK just aren't engaged or satisfied with their jobs at the moment, and that's going to have really detrimental consequences for society through diminished individual fulfillment because you're not stimulated or motivated at your work. And then there's the economic ramifications of that, where you're going to be less likely to be productive, or pay levels might be reduced, and that's going to negatively impact on wider living standards. And ultimately, there's an intrinsic good to employee voice, as it fosters a more collaborative, inclusive, democratic working culture. So all positive things in their own right. And these are all increasingly valued by investors, customers, and other wider stakeholders. And we know that voice mechanisms can help build trust in businesses by showing that companies aren't accountable just to their shareholders, but ultimately to the people who contribute to their success every day. And I know arguably workers who invest their labor have a stronger interest in the long-term health of the company, and ultimately they bear the greater risk for the failure of that company through pay cuts or job losses versus the shareholders who have likely to have kind of diversified portfolios. If one company fails, then they've got plenty others that they can rely on. So ultimately, it stands to reason that workers should therefore be provided with necessary representation and voice to influence that company strategy.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be really useful to know about like how in practice would worker directors on boards actually work.
Yeah, this is something we included in the Charter for Fair Pay that I mentioned earlier. One of the earlier questions about what we've been up to. So essentially, large businesses would be required to reserve a certain proportion of board positions for directors who would be elected by the workforce. And these directors would hold significant voting rights on key board decisions, whether that's influencing company strategy, wider ESG initiatives, or remuneration policy. And I think the important point to note is they wouldn't function solely as representatives responsible for defending workers' interests, but they would be bound to the same legal duties to act in the long-term interest of the company as any other director. So they would function much in the same way. However, the difference being that in their accountability to the workforce as they're elected, that would increase the likelihood of boards fulfilling their legal duty to pursue the best interest of the company in terms of all its stakeholders, essentially the employees as well, rather than just prioritizing the interests of shareholders.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. So you've really laid out perfectly why this issue is really important, why companies should be doing this. What's the current picture like? How are companies currently performing with regards to incorporating employee voice into their decision-making processes?
Unfortunately, not particularly well, is the kind of high pace interview on that. So there was a positive step forward in 2018. The Corporate Governance Code required companies to adopt one of three mechanisms for workforce engagement. Those potential three options being a director, as we've already spoken about, from the workforce. A second option was a formal workforce advisory panel to kind of provide advice to the wider board decision-making management. And finally, a designated non-executive director for workforce engagement who will go out and seek the views of the workforce and hopefully integrate it into company strategy. However, there has been a lot of research done into kind of the breadth of the adoption of these mechanisms, and there has been very limited uptake. So a 2023 assessment of the FTSE 350 found that 32% of firms hadn't actually adopted a single of these mechanisms, despite it being advised by the Corporate Governance Code. Just 40% had adopted non-executive directors for engagement, 12% advisory panels, and astonishingly, only one company had opted for a worker director. So I think you get a sense of which mechanisms, if they do adopt them, are the preference for companies. And further high percentage of research that we've done ourselves has shown that companies typically opt for those weaker forms of engagement, as I just kind of mentioned there. For instance, your employee surveys, site visits, or town hall meetings that don't kind of guarantee the same formal level of worker voice and consultation that a worker director does, who actually has the ability to vote on and contribute to company strategy. So yeah, there's still a lot to be done for companies to kind of meet these minimum standards as advised by the corporate governance code. Hence why we chose it as the kind of theme for our AGM season.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a really important topic, and it comes up a lot when we're working with investors within the Good Work Coalition, and when often we engage these large companies, and often what comes up is what avenues exist for that employee engagement, and often as the data shows, there aren't many. It would be really good to know a little bit more about what is best practice then. What does it look like? Also in the international context as well.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned there really is a range of mechanisms that a company can adopt if they're seeking to enhance the worker voice in their company. As I previously mentioned, electing a worker director to the company board, that's really the gold standard that we're aiming for. However, of course, it seems, as I said there, we're a long way off. Only one company from the FTSE 350 done that. So it's being realistic. There are a further array of mechanisms that can also be used. So how it does depend ultimately on how those mechanisms are implemented. You got take for instance the example of an employee advisory panel that can the effectiveness of that can depend heavily on how it's implemented and the specifics of that. For instance, in some cases, the companies, the panels they do adopt, they may lack access to senior decision makers, so they are less likely to contribute to strategy. They're often unable to set their own agenda. So, for instance, the actual interests and needs of workers that are really important often don't actually get on the agenda, while often firms often fail to report on how the panel's contributions have impacted wider firm strategy. And I think that last point is the most important. Having engaged with board members at these AGMs, often they'll tell you that the engagement survey or the advisory panel played a role in contributing to company strategy. However, when you look in the annual report, there's no evidence of what actually issues kind of were acted upon based on that. Or if you ask them after the AGM, they're very rarely able to tell you kind of what issues were changed because of the results of the engagement with the survey or the advisory panel. So there's a clear lack of accountability there. If a company is going to be engaging with an advisory panel, there has to be some kind of evidence as to results of that, essentially. So ultimately, voice mechanisms, they have to be empowered to set their own agendas. They have to operate independently of management. They have to have access to senior decision makers, and there has to be that firm chain of accountability I've just mentioned, where a company can publicly demonstrate that the results of any engagement with employees has resulted in genuine change in company decision making. So the second part of your question, in terms of how the UK relates to the wider European and international context, there's a metric called the European Participation Index, and that essentially ranks the degree of worker participation in business decision making in different European countries. And unfortunately, the UK is we placed 26th out of 28 countries on that ranking, which is just astonishing, to be honest. And we know from research that a stronger EPI score is correlated with lower inequality levels, lower poverty rates, lower and fairer levels of executive remuneration, and higher productivity. So it goes back to, again, about how this is in the interest of not just workers, but also businesses themselves. Where mechanisms such as worker directors and boards are more established, famously Germany and the Nordic countries, there's a multitude of research highlighting the positive effects this can have. So it's kind of the same thing. There's a long way for the UK to go before we meet kind of the levels that we see in Europe currently.
Yeah, that figure is very embarrassing. 26 out of 28 is not good, and really just demonstrates the need for change, and also the really important work that you're doing in getting this out there. So it'd be really useful to know how all these different stakeholders can work together to advance employee voice in these decision-making processes.
Yeah, good question. So, yeah, I mean, the first kind of thing to think about is legislation and regulation, how that can play. a key role in strengthening employee engagement. Ultimately by setting minimum standards for companies to meet on these mechanisms. Of course, I did mention that we saw the corporate governance code, kind of the first kind of attempt to do that, but as I pointed out, there hasn't been much adoption of that so far. So there's still a lot to be done with where regulation is concerned, and ultimately using that to ensure that companies adopt meaningful and consistent practices for employee voice. Moving further down the chain, investors they can use their influence to push for stronger employee voice mechanisms as part of their responsible stewardship approaches. That could include things like supporting shareholder resolutions, something that you and the Good Work team are obviously very familiar with. We work on that over the last few years. So that'd be something like resolutions of worker engagement, or also for investors integrating workforce voice into their investment strategy frameworks or in their direct engagement with firms. And we do know that is something that more and more investors are pushing for at the moment, which is good to see. As I mentioned, policymakers, they can set baseline standards, and then thinking about people like ShareAction and ourselves, civil society organizations do also play a crucial role in shaping the public political discourse by holding companies accountable for where they aren't meeting such kind of minimum or decent standards on workforce engagement. For instance, that could look like assessing their engagement practices, attending their AGMs, of course, and asking questions on that, and using this to inform research that builds the case for reform and better standards for workforce voice.
Yeah, well, appreciate the plug. As I'm sure you're aware, the real focus of ShareAction, and particularly the Good Word team, over the past proxy season has been the 3 shareholder resolutions that we filed at a select group of UK retailers. And we saw quite incredible support, ranging from 26% at Next to 31% at M&S. And it really demonstrated the sort of investor appetite for this sort of topic. And also an expectation of that companies need to improve on this. It'll be obviously really interesting to see how that develops, and also the point around employee voice. I mean, how have you found sort of engaging companies on this issue this year?
I mean, as someone like yourself who's got experience of attending AGMs, it can be tricky at times. All firms that we spoke to and engaged with, they all acknowledged the growing importance of employee voice. However, we did find in practice that most of them were still relying on these less formal and less impactful mechanisms, like town hall meetings or engagement surveys, or appointing a non-executive director, as recommended by the governance code. And ultimately, this is kind of a failing of the governance code itself, really, as it allows companies to claim compliance with the code by showing they've got a non-executive director for workforce engagement, but often they haven't actually embedded kind of genuine formal mechanisms for employee representation. So it is often a get out of jail card for these companies, as they can kind of reference how they've met these kind of requirements without actually kind of implementing kind of serious and formal mechanisms for voice. And yeah, I mean, this is often because, taking the example of non-executive directors, they often only meet with workforce representatives a couple or a handful of times a year. Not in all cases. There are cases where they are better, but in some cases it might only be a couple of times a year. They might rarely engage on substantive issues like pay and conditions, and often there isn't much accountability for whether the engagement has had any tangible outcomes. And as I said, this really highlights a deeper issue with the current corporate governance code, as it encourages workforce engagement but doesn't guarantee those formal structures that we know are needed to ensure meaningful influence. And really, as a result, employee voice becomes kind of a tick box exercise rather than a strategic priority for businesses.
Yeah, as you mentioned, obviously, you've had experience of attending AGMs this year and raising this issue, and it's obviously something that we do a lot at ShareAction. We really advocate for the use of AGM activism and shareholder rights, and it's something that we encourage everyone to get involved in and sign up on our website. But it would be really interesting to hear about why you think AGM activism is so important.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's obviously what you've said a couple of questions ago about the work that ShareAction have done with the resolutions. I think it's really demonstrated to everyone who's working kind of pushing AGM activism and going to AGMs of the potential for real change that is there when you have these kind of concerted efforts between different stakeholders to push for change in these crucial issues. From my own personal perspective and experience of going to these AGMs, I think they're really crucial because they allow us, to provide a platform for stakeholders to hold companies to account on these key issues, whether that's governance, living wage campaigns, pay, or employee engagements we've done this year. And as individuals, we gain the opportunity to raise these critical topics directly with board decision makers at the company's most important meeting. So it is a really, really vital opportunity for us to take. Beyond pushing for that immediate change, AGM activism can also be beneficial in the longer term because we build dialogue and contact with these board members who ultimately determine the future and strategy of the companies that we're engaging with. That can lead to positive and constructive engagement in the future, enabling stakeholders to influence company practices over time. And I think it's quite an iterative process. You might not expect to get change in the first or even the second or third year you go to an AGM, but it's really about being in it for the long haul, showing your face each year, showing that you care about these issues, that they're not going away, that companies are going to have to do more on them, and really just being there each year, as I said, and just pushing for that ultimate change. And yeah, the final kind of point on AGM activism is that it can play a key role in shaping the wider public discourse, as I said, by putting these important issues on the agenda, ensuring that the research that many people do into these issues actually reaches a wider audience and helps to drive broader awareness and ultimately encourages the better business practice that we all want to see.
Yeah, I mean, you summarize it really well, and I think just one sort of final thought for me. I mean, we have this conversation today about worker voice and employee voice and the importance of having different perspectives in those decisions. And at the end of the day, that's also what you've been able to do this AGM season. You've attended those AGMs, you've raised this issue and inserted it into those conversations. Conversations which those perspectives are typically their perspectives are typically absent from. So as you say, you've got to be in it for the long haul, but it's really valuable. It's really important work. So yeah, I mean, just thank you so much for sharing what you've been doing this year, this AGM season, and we're really looking forward to seeing how it develops.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ruan, and thanks again for ShareAction for giving us such a hand over the last 6 months with that.
Thanks, Paddy. Have a great day.